The grand Vanderholt estate shimmered under the evening sky, its golden chandeliers visible through tall windows, a symbol of power and prestige. Inside, Richard and Eleanor Vanderholt moved gracefully among their distinguished guests, ensuring that everything about their son's engagement announcement was flawless. Their son, William, stood near the fireplace, dressed in an impeccable black suit. But while his posture was poised, his hands clenched at his sides, his nervousness barely concealed. The reason for his unease stood beside him, Naomi Carter. Naomi was beautiful, but not in the polished, refined way of high society women. Her dark curls framed a kind face, and her eyes gleamed with warmth and honesty. She wasn't raised among grand ballrooms and expensive silks. Instead, she grew up in a quiet, loving home, the daughter of a simple craftsman. The guests whispered behind gloved hands, their gazes flitting between William and Naomi, wondering why he had chosen someone so ordinary. And then there was Joseph Carter, Naomi's father. The elderly man stood quietly by the entrance, his calloused hands folded in front of him. His suit, though clean and pressed, was noticeably plain, lacking the designer labels the other men boasted. The Vanderholts regarded him with thinly veiled amusement, though he seemed unaffected by their unspoken judgment. Eleanor Vanderholt, in her emerald gown, leaned toward her husband. "This is a disaster," she whispered sharply. "Imagine what people will say. William marrying into this?" Richard exhaled slowly. "It's a phase," he muttered. "He'll realize soon enough." But William's love for Naomi was no phase. He admired her kindness, her strength, and the way she always found joy in the simplest things. He wasn't marrying her for wealth or status. He was marrying her because she made his life richer in a way his family never could. The engagement dinner was meant to be a celebration, but an undercurrent of tension thickened the air. The conversations, while polite, carried an unmistakable chill whenever they turned toward Naomi's background. "Naomi dear," a wealthy socialite cooed, forcing a smile. "What does your father do again?" Naomi smiled proudly. "He's a wood craftsman. He creates beautiful, intricate pieces by hand." The woman raised a perfectly arched brow. "How charming." A few guests stifled chuckles. Across the table, Eleanor exchanged glances with her friends, their amusement barely hidden. Joseph Carter, however, remained calm, as if their words did not reach him. At the head of the table, Richard tapped his wine glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, standing up, "I believe now would be the perfect time for a toast." Everyone turned their attention to him. "We are, of course, thrilled about this engagement," Richard continued, though his tone lacked warmth. "William has always had a strong mind of his own, choosing his own path." He let the words linger, a subtle jab at his son's unconventional choice. "And so we welcome Naomi and her background into our family." A smattering of applause followed, though some exchanged knowing smiles. Naomi's cheeks burned, but she held her head high. Joseph then rose from his seat. "If I may," he said. His voice, though quiet, carried weight. "I would like to offer a small gift in honor of this union." A servant stepped forward, carrying a velvet box. Joseph took it and turned toward William and Naomi. "This," he said, opening the box, "is my family's legacy." Inside was a wooden mask, its surface polished to perfection, carved with intricate designs that told a story. It was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever seen. Laughter broke the silence. It was Eleanor. "A mask," she scoffed. "How unique." Joseph ignored her and turned to William. "This mask was carved by my great-grandfather, passed down through generations. It carries the essence of my family, not of wealth, but of craftsmanship, tradition, and love." A hush fell over the room. Joseph continued, his gaze steady. "You see, money can be lost. Titles can fade. But the values we pass down, the love we leave behind, that is true wealth." For the first time, the Vanderholt guests had no clever remarks. Even Richard and Eleanor looked uncertain. William took the mask with reverence. He traced the delicate carvings, feeling the stories embedded in the wood. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Naomi squeezed her father's hand, tears brimming in her eyes. Joseph then looked around the room. "You mock my gift because it is not made of gold. But I ask you, What do you have that cannot be bought? Silence. The room, so full of wealth and grandeur, suddenly felt empty. Eleanor cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. Well, she started, but for once, she had nothing to say. Richard lowered his gaze. His whole life, he had measured worth by possessions, by status. But standing before him was a man who had given his daughter something he never could, an inheritance of love, of purpose. One of the guests, an elderly businessman, finally spoke. It's remarkable, he admitted. Not just the mask, but the meaning behind it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. For the first time that evening, Joseph smiled. He hadn't sought their approval, nor had he expected it. He had simply shared his truth. And, despite themselves, they had listened. That night, as the guests departed, there was a quiet shift in the air. The whispers weren't of mockery, but of admiration. In the days that followed, the Vanderholts found themselves reflecting on that night. For years, they had prided themselves on their lineage, their fortunes. But for the first time, they questioned what they were truly leaving behind. At the wedding, William and Naomi exchanged vows under a simple archway, decorated not with extravagant flowers, but with carved wooden ornaments, a tribute to the man who had given them a lesson far more valuable than gold. And though Richard and Eleanor would never fully shed their aristocratic ways, something in them had changed. They no longer saw Joseph as a mere craftsman, but as a man of profound wisdom. As Joseph watched his daughter begin a new chapter, he smiled, knowing that his true legacy, the one that truly mattered, would live on. As William and Naomi exchanged rings, the air was filled with a warmth that no amount of wealth could buy. The guests, many of whom had once whispered doubts about their union, now watched with quiet reverence. Joseph stood at the front, his weathered hands clasped together, pride shining in his eyes. Richard and Eleanor Vanderholt sat in the first row, their expressions unreadable. But something in their demeanor had softened. Eleanor, who had once scoffed at the idea of her son marrying outside of high society, found herself wiping a stray tear. When the ceremony ended, and William leaned down to kiss his bride, a heartfelt applause erupted. The sound wasn't just polite, it was genuine. At the reception, Joseph stood beside Naomi and William, receiving guests as if he had always belonged in such circles. People who had once dismissed him now approached with curiosity. One gentleman, a renowned art collector, gestured toward the wooden ornaments decorating the wedding venue. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I must admit, I had no idea craftsmanship like this still existed." Joseph smiled. "It does, if you know where to look." Eleanor, standing nearby, cleared her throat. "Joseph," she began, hesitating slightly, "I wanted to thank you for the mask. I see now that it wasn't just a gift." Joseph nodded, his eyes twinkling with understanding. "No, Mrs. Vanderholt, it wasn't. But I'm glad you see its value now." Richard, who had been silent most of the evening, finally spoke. "You were right," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "Legacy isn't about money. It's about what we leave behind in the hearts of others." Joseph clapped a hand on his shoulder. It's never too late to build the right legacy. In the weeks that followed the wedding, a remarkable change took place. Eleanor, once the epitome of high society exclusivity, began attending local artisan markets. She was seen admiring handcrafted jewelry, handwoven fabrics, and, most surprisingly, wooden sculptures. Richard, who had always measured a man's worth by his net worth, found himself seeking deeper conversations. One evening, he invited Joseph over for dinner, much to Eleanor's shock. "I want to understand," Richard admitted as he poured them both a glass of wine. "Your perspective, your values. I spent my whole life chasing things that don't last. Maybe it's time I learned about the things that do." Joseph chuckled. "It only took you one wooden mask to figure that out?" Richard shook his head, smiling. "It took meeting the man who gave it." Years passed, and William and Naomi built a home filled with love and laughter. In their living room, above the fireplace, hung the wooden mask, the same heirloom Joseph had once gifted them. When their first child was born, they named him Daniel Joseph Vanderholt, a tribute to the man who had taught them the greatest lesson of all. One day, As Joseph sat with his grandson on his lap, the little boy pointed at the mask. "Grandpa, what's that?" Joseph smiled and ran a gentle hand over the smooth wood. "That, my boy, is a reminder that the richest man is not the one with the most money, but the one with the most love." As the child giggled and rested his head against his grandfather's chest, Joseph knew his legacy would live on, not in gold or titles, but in the hearts of those who truly mattered. Seasons changed, years rolled by, and life continued its steady rhythm. The Vanderholt estate, once a symbol of cold aristocracy, became a home filled with warmth. Naomi and William raised their children with the values Joseph had instilled in them: humility, kindness, and the understanding that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in the love they shared. Joseph, now well into his 80s, spent much of his time in the home William and Naomi had built. He would sit in the garden, whittling small wooden toys for his grandchildren, his hands as steady as ever despite his age. Richard and Eleanor visited often. The transformation in them had been slow but undeniable. Eleanor no longer looked down upon simplicity. In fact, she had taken to learning about traditional craft herself. Richard had become softer, more reflective, spending more time with his grandchildren than he ever had with William when he was young. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Joseph sat quietly at the head of the table, listening to the laughter and conversations around him. His heart swelled with pride. Naomi noticed the faraway look in her father's eyes. She reached for his hand. "Dad, what are you thinking about?" Joseph smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice full of warmth, "that this is the legacy I always hoped for." Not long after that evening, Joseph's health began to decline. The once strong, unshakable craftsman grew weaker, and his time spent in his workshop became less frequent. Naomi, William, and the children cared for him with devotion, ensuring he was always surrounded by love. One crisp autumn morning, Joseph called William to his side. "There's something I want you to have," he said. William knelt beside him, listening intently. Joseph gestured toward a small wooden box on the bedside table. "Open it." Inside was a carving, another mask, but this one was unfinished. The details were delicate but incomplete, the final touches missing. "I started this for you," Joseph murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was meant to be a gift for when I no longer could be here." William's throat tightened. "Dad." Joseph gave him a weak smile. "I want you to finish it. Carve the last details with your own hands." Tears welled in William's eyes. He had never been a craftsman like his father-in-law, but he knew this wasn't just about carving wood. It was about carrying forward the lessons Joseph had taught him, to build something meaningful, to leave behind something greater than wealth. That night, Joseph passed away peacefully, surrounded by family. In the weeks that followed, William kept his promise. He spent hours in Joseph's old workshop, carefully finishing the mask with trembling hands. When he was done, he placed it beside the first mask, the one Joseph had given him all those years ago. At Joseph's memorial, Richard stood before the gathered family and friends. He cleared his throat, struggling to find words. Then, he turned to the wooden masks displayed at the front of the room. "I used to think that a man's worth was measured by what he owned," Richard admitted. "But Joseph Carter, he showed me how wrong I was. He left us something far greater than riches. He left us wisdom, love, and a family that will carry his legacy forward." Eleanor, standing beside him, wiped a tear from her cheek. As William looked down at his son, Daniel, he handed him a small block of wood and a carving knife. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's start something new." And so the tradition continued. The wealth of the Vanderholts had once been measured in gold and status, but now it was counted in love, memories, and the lessons passed down from one generation to the next. Joseph Carter had left the world, but his legacy lived on, not in a name, not in money, but in the hands of his grandson, carving a new story with every stroke.